A very Merry Christmas to each and every one of you. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity. This is a special bonus episode, The History of Christmas. So glad that you're a part of this today. I hope that you'll have fun with me learning a little bit about the traditions of Christmas and hope that you're preparing yourself for a great time this year. In the ancient church, Easter was the most important observed holiday. The celebration of Christ's birth did not enter the church until much later. If you've been a part of this study on the history of Christianity, you know very well that Easter was the day for Christians. It was the day in the ancient Christian world in which baptisms happened. It only happened once a year, and that was during Easter. And it was also the day that a culmination of a 3-year discipleship process ended with those that had gone through that 3-year process becoming full-fledged members of the church and then being baptized on Easter Sunday. So early on, the observance of Christ's birth was not a factor whatsoever in the celebrations of the early church. The earliest feast day connected to the birth of Jesus was January 6th, known as Epiphany, the day of his manifestation. During the first 2 centuries of Christianity, there was opposition to the pagan tradition of celebrating birthdays. This was true of recognizing the birthdays of martyrs and certainly of Jesus. The early Christians would have celebrated martyrs by celebrating the day of their death. They would have looked at that as their true birthday, the day that they were birthed into eternal life and that they gave their lives for the faith. So they did not like the practice of celebrating birthdays because they associated it with paganism. And so it would not have even entered into their minds to think of celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ. In the Roman Empire, December 25th marked a popular holiday, Deo Salus Invicti Nata, day of the birth of the unconquered sun. The people believed that winter came because the sun god became sick and weak. This holiday celebrated the winter solstice as a symbol of the resurgence of the sun, the casting away of winter, and the heralding of the rebirth of spring and summer. It was common practice for Christians as they moved into areas with pagan traditions to Christianize them. So just a word about this. Christians, as they would go into new areas, as they developed Christianity through the Western world and the pagan world of the early Roman Empire, what they found was a very effective way of bringing people into Christianity was to use their already established traditions, and many of those surrounded celebrations and holidays, and they would take the same traditions the people already had in place, and they would give Christian meaning to them. And so in that way, it made it easier for people that were not familiar with Christianity to understand Christianity and to become comfortable with the customs of Christianity because they were using something that they were already very familiar with. And this was a very effective way of spreading Christianity. And you think, well, is that really a good way to do it? Well, if you remember in Scripture, Paul went to Mars Hill, and on Mars Hill, he found there a pagan statue to the unknown God. And Paul used that to explain to them about the unknown God that he was there to tell them about, the God of Christianity. So he used something that was already in place in the pagan world, something they were familiar with, to explain to them the truths of the real God. So I think that the practice is sound, and it was, again, very effective in the spread of Christianity around the world, and it was used during the time that Christians were in the pagan days of the Roman Empire. Taking a day that celebrated the rebirth of the sun and turning it into a day celebrating the birth of God's Son would have been in keeping with this custom. This is one theory for why December 25th became the day Christ's birth was celebrated. So just a word on this, I'm sure you already know, there's no way that Jesus was born on December 25th. It wouldn't have been the correct time. There's nothing about his birth that we have in Scripture, or even from the historical things we know about census taking and all of that. There's nothing that would make us think December would have even been the right month, certainly not December 25th being the right day. So why was that day picked? Well, we really don't know for sure. There's different theories as to why. This is one theory that I think holds a lot of weight. I like it because I do know that the early Christians were trying to use things already established in the pagan world to bring about Christian meaning, and it would have been very easy for them to take somebody that was worshiping the rebirth of the sun, the physical sun, and using that to explain to them about the birth of God's son, and even going so far as to then telling them about his death on the cross and his rebirth, his coming back from the dead. Very similar to what they believed about the sun god, that he was becoming very sick and weak as winter dragged on, but then once the days were becoming longer and the sun was in the sky longer, he was reborn. And so it just really makes a lot of sense. I like the theory, but again, there are some that would not agree with that and would think it was different things, and that's fine. But this is one reason that perhaps the church adopted this December 25th date for the birth of Christ. We can't talk about Christmas without looking at the Roman celebration called Saturnalia. Saturnalia, held in mid-December, is an ancient Roman pagan festival honoring the agricultural god Saturn. Originally, the holiday lasted one day, but eventually it became a week-long celebration. So this was a big festival in the Roman world, one of the biggest ones they had. Saturnalia celebrations are the source of many of the traditions that became associated with Christmas. So as we look through these, you're going to find that there's some things that are very much in keeping with what we still do today that were going on during this original Saturnalia celebration that turned into a Christmas celebration. And so many of the traditions associated with it carried right on over into Christmas. One practice involved offering gifts or sacrifices to the gods during the winter sowing season, so the practice of giving gifts. People also decorated their homes with wreaths and other greenery. We find this in traditions all through the ancient world and into Europe. So many people found greenery, evergreen, to be very significant. And it's easy to understand why. A culture where you have very much a need for agriculture, the winter is a hard time, and you're looking for hope that there's going to be a harvest come and the world's going to become warm again and life is going to carry on. And one symbol of that hope was the evergreen, the thing that didn't die in the wintertime. And so it became used all throughout the ancient world, and certainly Rome was one. And during this celebration of Saturnalia, people bringing in the green into their homes was a big deal. Instead of working, Romans spent Saturnalia gambling, singing, playing music, feasting, socializing, and giving each other gifts. So many of those things very much associated with Christmas to this day. Maybe not so much gambling, although for some that might be, but widespread. Singing is a huge part of Christmas, playing music, feasting together, having a meal, socializing, being with friends and family, and then giving each other gifts certainly are things that we associate very strongly with Christmas. Coins and other small objects were also often hidden in cakes. So this is another tradition that we find in different Christmas traditions in different cultures and even other celebrations as well. And that's the practice of hiding some kind of a trinket, a coin, something in a cake or a baked good that somebody would be able to find. So this was a part of Saturnalia as well. Well, eventually, Christmas becomes actually Christmas. The pagan holiday Saturnalia was preempted by the celebration of Christmas after the time of Constantine. So when Constantine came in as emperor, we know that he brought Christianity into prominence. He legalized Christianity, and he began to normalize the celebration of Christianity in the country. And so with that, this pagan holiday Saturnalia gained less steam, and it was replaced at the same time of year with the celebration of Christmas. And so even though Saturnalia wasn't being celebrated any longer, instead it was Christmas, many of those traditions that came along with Saturnalia just carried right on. In an effort to encourage Roman pagans to accept Christianity as Rome's official religion, many pagan traditions were incorporated into Christmas. Before the end of the 4th century, giving gifts, singing, lighting candles, feasting, and merrymaking had become absorbed by the traditions of Christmas. So all of these things that were going on during the celebration of Saturnalia now become the traditions of Christmas. Christmas began to be widely celebrated with a specific liturgy in the 9th century, but still did not hold the same importance as Good Friday or Easter. So for the majority of the history of Christianity, it is Easter that holds the most significance, and probably still is today. And yet the biggest holiday celebrated worldwide is Christmas. No question about that. So It eventually flips, but it does take a while before Christmas gains the prominence that it does, even though it's slowly becoming part of the culture and becoming more and more important in the Christian world. As Christianity expanded, Christmas picked up more practices originally associated with similar pagan celebrations at the same time of year. So what I want to do now with the rest of this time we have together is I want to look at specific Christmas traditions and look at the background of those traditions. You're going to find that many of them had to do with Roman culture, but they also had to do with Western European culture as Christianity expanded into the West. And as the time came when the Roman Empire ended and some of those Western civilizations began to come into the old ancient Roman Empire, they spread their traditions as well. So we'll look at some of these specific things and look at the background of where they came from so you'll have an understanding of where some of our traditions originated. And we'll begin by the use of holly. Holly has been associated with Christmas for almost 1,700 years, but it was an important facet of December prior to Christ's birth. Holly was used by the Romans during their winter solstice festivals, but it was probably first used with the Celts. The Druids believed a constant war was going on between the Oak King and the Holly King. Holly always won in the winter as the oaks lost their leaves while the holly did not. So this idea of nature being something to be worshipped was certainly not unique to the Druids, but it was actually a part of many ancient cultures and their belief systems. And they personified these things as the Oak King, the oak trees, and the Holly King, the holly. And so they noticed that during the winter, the oak lost its strength, it lost its leaves, it looked weak, but the holly flourished. It was evergreen and grew berries. And so in their mind, that meant that the Holly King was the one that had power during the winter months and the Oak King lost power. The Druids instructed the Celts that holly was the most powerful plant in the woods. People picked boughs of holly and brought them in their homes. So this tradition was not just going on in the Roman Empire or bringing the greenery in, as I said earlier. It's happened in a lot of different places, and certainly the Celts were one of these, and they brought holly in. It was very significant for them. They looked at it as being a plant of peacefulness. They looked at it as being good luck. They looked at it even as having healing properties. So they definitely wanted to have holly in their homes. Roman soldiers likely brought the concept of decorating with holly back to their country when they returned from duty in Britain. So certainly the Roman Empire expanded into Great Britain, and they noticed this going on. They were already used to bringing green in, so they adopted the bringing in of holly. Once there, holly quickly became associated with Saturnalia, which makes sense. During the celebration, holly wreaths with bright red berries were given as gifts. So the idea, again, that goes straight into Christmas was already taking place in the celebration of Saturnalia. Wreaths made of holly with the bright red berries used in homes, used as decorations, and also given as gifts. As with other Saturnalia traditions, holly was adopted by Christians in celebrating Christmas. Christians used holly as a teaching tool to explain the life and death of Christ. The prickly leaves became associated with the crown of thorns, and the red berries were symbolic of his blood. Again, the Christians did this. They commonly did it. They would find something that resonated with the people in the place that they would expand to or the places that they lived, and they would use those things that had been used as pagan traditions. They would adopt them, but they didn't adopt them in the pagan sense. They would Christianize them. So they found that this holly could be used to explain some things about Christ and to teach about him. The holly has prickly leaves, so that reminded the early Christians of Christ's crown of thorns. And so if you make a holly into a wreath, you've already got something round. It's easy to then talk about the crown of thorns. Just like these leaves are prickly, imagine putting one of these on your head. Well, Jesus Christ had a crown of thorns. And then the red berries that stood out very much in the wintertime was very easy for them to adopt and became symbolic of the shed blood of Jesus Christ. So Christians used this. They took it to their advantage, and it became an excellent teaching tool. And again, holly now is adopted into Christianity as a symbol of Christ. It's adopted into the celebration of Christmas because it came as a part of Saturnalia and becomes widespread in Christianity as being used to celebrate Christmas. And still today we bring green into our homes. We celebrate with green, and holly's one of those that's a big part of that. Now let's look at Christmas trees. The history of Christmas trees goes back to the symbolic use of evergreens in ancient Egypt and Rome. Plants and trees that remained green all year had a special meaning to people in the ancient world during the winter. Ancient people hung evergreen boughs over their doors and windows. In northern Europe, the Druids decorated their temples with evergreen boughs as a symbol of everlasting life. Seeing this green, flourishing plants and trees in the wintertime impressed people because everything else was dead and covered. And so they put a large amount of significance on these plants, on these trees, and they wanted to bring them in. They wanted to adorn their homes with them. They wanted to take advantage of whatever the special quality was that kept them alive while everything else died. The Vikings in Scandinavia thought that evergreens were the special plants of the sun god Balder. In other countries, it was believed that evergreen would keep away witches, ghosts, evil spirits, and illness, so kind of like a talisman or a good luck charm. Germany likely started the Christmas tree tradition as we know it today. During the 16th century, devout Christians brought decorated trees into their homes. So again, Christianity's expanded, it's brought these traditions with it. And now there's this idea in Germany that let's bring these trees into our homes. Let's not just leave them outside. Let's not just decorate them outside. Let's do as has been done through the years. Let's bring the trees in. We'll decorate them and we'll bring them into our homes during Christmas time. The first record of a Christmas tree on display in America was in the 1830s by the German settlers of Pennsylvania, although trees had been a tradition in many German homes much earlier. So there is historical record that a Christmas tree was on display in America. So on display for the town, not just in somebody's house, but actually openly on display in the 1830s by German settlers of Pennsylvania. Most 19th century Americans found Christmas trees an oddity. Some even viewed them as pagan symbols. So groups like the Puritans, they didn't like this. They knew that bringing in the green and even the Christmas tree, those were things that had its origin in pagan ideas. And they knew that. They knew the history of them. And so for them, they felt like that's something they didn't want to adopt. They didn't like the pagan origins. And so they didn't want Christmas trees. They were frowned upon. Their religious practice would have said that that was a sin. You can't bring Christmas trees in. And yet they didn't win out on that. By the 1890s, Christmas tree ornaments were arriving from Germany, and Christmas tree popularity was on the rise around the U.S. And of course, we know today Christmas trees are everywhere. Most people now, I guess it's most people, I would assume so, have artificial trees that they keep in their homes. Some keep them up year round, actually, but you take them down, put them in a box or whatever, a bag, and they're back up the next year. The practice of going out and getting a live tree, whether you buy it or cut it down, definitely not what it used to be, but still having a Christmas tree in your home, the symbol of everlasting life that originally was a worship of nature, but began to be Christianized into a remembrance of the everlasting nature of God and everlasting life offered by Jesus Christ. We still carry those traditions on today, and Christmas trees are seen during Christmas time all throughout the year in homes in America and around the world. It's interesting to look at the tradition of lights in homes. The tradition of putting lights on Christmas trees was begun by reformer Martin Luther. While taking a late-night December walk through the German woods, Luther was enthralled with the way the starlight looked as it filtered through the branches of the evergreen tree. So Luther's out taking a walk. He sees a little twinkling light coming through from the moon and the stars through those beautiful evergreen trees in the German woods, and he's just really taken aback by this. It's a big moment for him. He just sits and stares at it, and he thinks about the awe and the wonder of this beautiful sight. So he wanted to duplicate that. So in an attempt to duplicate the atmosphere of this outdoor event, Luther attached candle holders to the limbs of the tree in his own home. So he goes home, he's got his tree up. It's December, he's a German, and they bring the Christmas trees in. So he's got his tree up, and he starts thinking, I want to make my tree look like what I saw out in those woods. And the way to do that was for him to attach candle holders to the limbs and put candles in them and light them up. Well, this excited his family and friends. When they saw the very first brightly lit Christmas tree, they loved it. The tradition of putting candles on Christmas trees quickly swept across Germany. Luther taught the children that the candles represented the light that Jesus brought into the world. Craftsmen began to produce ornate candle holders, so these guys saw a business opportunity. The people want candles on their tree. Let me create something that's specifically designed to be on the tree. And they were made specifically for attaching to tree limbs. There was also specifically designed multicolored candles that soon followed. By the mid-1800s, beautiful evergreen trees trimmed with ornaments and lit by scores of candles became common. Now, you're probably having at this point the same thought I had. We're putting live flame on dead tree. Is this a great idea? Surely there were some of these trees caught on fire. Well, actually, there was a lot. These trees were a tremendous fire hazard. Many people lost their homes, and some even died after Christmas trees caught on fire. Firemen of the day would warn people. They discouraged, don't light up your Christmas tree, but it didn't matter. People loved seeing those lit trees so much that they took the risk, and they continued to bring in these Christmas trees and put candles on them and light them up. Well, that changed in 1882. At that time, Edward Johnson, who was an employee of Thomas Edison, developed the first string of electric Christmas lights. He created a string of 80 small and brightly colored electric light bulbs. He took them home and strung them around his tree. At a time when most people still didn't have electricity, the tree garnered a lot of attention. So this guy, Edward Johnson, he got to thinking about, I don't want to have fire lighting up my tree anymore because it's going to burn my house down eventually. And he's a part of Thomas Edison's discovery of electricity, development of electricity, and he knows how to put these light bulbs together. So he gets an idea. Let me go string a bunch of lights up, and I'll make a string of them. He did 80 of them, and I'm going to bring them home, and I'm going to string them on my tree. Well, that was an impressive thing. People had never seen anything like it before. Most people still didn't even have electricity. He did because he was an employee of Edison. And so they loved it, but they couldn't get it themselves. So it didn't take off then, but at least it was developed. And at first, the cost of electric Christmas lights made them a luxury only the wealthy could afford. It wasn't until after World War I that prices dropped low enough for middle-class shoppers to purchase. So it wasn't until after the First World War that actually even middle-class people could get them, but still, they're still cost prohibitive. It's not something that just everybody can get. Upper-class people had them for a little while by then. Middle-class people start to have them. The poor could not. But something changes. In 1924, General Electric and Westinghouse introduced a new set of Christmas lights that were so inexpensive almost anyone could afford them. From that time on, electric Christmas lights became the standard in almost every American home celebrating Christmas. So finally, in 1924, a very inexpensive string of Christmas lights is developed. No more fire on the Christmas trees. All that goes away. It's now electric lights only, and people have them all over their houses. You can ride around. Not everybody does, obviously. Almost anybody that's got a Christmas tree is going to have lights on it, but people have them all over their houses. They have them outside in trees, on their houses, all around. There's all kinds of different lights. So lights is a big deal at Christmas time, and we see this starting with one of the reformers, Martin Luther, as he decided to bring in candles and light up his Christmas tree. All right, so for this next section, we are going to be discussing Santa Claus, and this is a discussion for adults, not children. So just want to make sure to give you that opportunity to fast forward or move people on that don't need to be hearing this. Just give you an opportunity to take care of that. I thought about not even doing this one, but it's just too much. If we're going to talk about history of the church, there's too much about this that has to do with church history, so we're going to do it. So let's go and move forward to talk about Santa Claus. The legend of Santa Claus stretches back to a monk named St. Nicholas. Most people have heard of St. Nick. No historical records exist of his life, so nothing for certain is known about him. We know there was a St. Nicholas. We know some things about him. He became a saint, obviously, and he's very well revered, but don't have a lot of information about him other than legends. And we don't know what is true or not about them. They could all be true. We just don't know. Probably not all true, but the things we know about him are very limited as far as actual concrete information. Nicholas was born sometime around 280 AD. I actually saw a lot of different dates for this. I saw 270, 280. I even saw into the 300s. I don't think that's right. But again, it just shows you that there's not even agreement about when he was born. There is agreement about this. He was born in modern-day Turkey and he lived there. Nicholas became admired for his piety and kindness. He became the subject of many legends. You probably heard some of those. He is said to have given away all of his inherited wealth in order to travel the countryside helping the poor and sick. Over the years, Nicholas's popularity grew. He became known as the protector of children and sailors. Soon, St. Nicholas was remembered and celebrated with a feast on the anniversary of his death, December 6th. So the early recognition of St. Nicholas wasn't on December 25th and associated with Christmas, but it was actually December 6th, which was the anniversary of his death. But it's easy to see how he got associated with Christmas. It's in December. If he had died in April or during the summer, it may very well be that he never would have been associated with Christmas. But since his death and the celebration of his life on the anniversary of his death took place in December, so close to the date of the celebration of Christ's birth, the two got linked together. On St. Nicholas Eve, children would set out food for Nicholas and straw for his donkey. So in the morning on St. Nicholas Day, the celebration of his life, the children awoke to find their gifts replaced with sweets and toys. So early on, we see this idea of St. Nicholas being in some way honored by the children, that he's going to come during the night. They're going to leave food for him and straw for his donkey. And then when the children wake up in the morning, what do they find? Those things are gone. And in their place, St. Nicholas has left them sweets and toys. So it's easy to see how this now is going to translate as time goes on. St. Nicholas's story might have faded into history if not for the 10th century Christian author Metaphrastes. He collected many stories of St. Nicholas, most more legend than fact. These stories inspired many people who heard them. Soon, a character resembling St. Nicholas was invented in each European country. St. Nicholas was brought to America by European immigrants. In December 1773 and 1774, a New York newspaper reported groups of Dutch families celebrating the anniversary of his death. The name Santa Claus developed from the Dutch nickname Sinterklaas. The modern image of Santa Claus is derived from an Episcopal minister, Clement Clarke Moore. In 1822, he wrote a Christmas poem. You've all heard it. It's actually entitled An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, but we know it as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. So this poem describes Santa Claus in the way that we traditionally recognize him. If you go back in history and look at the different countries, the different cultures, and how they looked at this figure of St. Nicholas, what he looked like, how he dressed, there are very different ways. We don't have time to get into a bunch of those, but they're way different, vastly different from the way we look at Santa Claus now. And obviously those traditions were floating out there, but this guy, Clement Clarke Moore, actually put them into a poem that he wrote it for his children, but eventually published it. And it became so popular and so ingrained in the culture that that's the way, from his description, that's the way people started to represent Santa Claus. And then it got nailed down even more. In 1881, cartoonist Thomas Nast used Moore's poem to create the likeness of Santa Claus, which we know today. So the poem talked about what Santa Claus looked like. Thomas Nast actually drew a picture of Santa Claus. He drew pictures of him, and he used the description of this poem to make his drawing of Santa Claus. So then it's not only heard about, now it's actually seen, and it catches on till today worldwide for the most part, certainly in Western world and in America. This is the very specific way Santa Claus is viewed, the way we see him. A jolly old man, white beard, fat belly, rosy cheeks, all of that stuff comes right from this. And it's ingrained in the culture now. Doesn't matter if any of those other things about St. Nicholas and the saint story and all of that stuff is gone. And we've got Santa Claus from this. While some Christians view the Santa Claus tradition as taking away from the true meaning of Christmas, the legend is still one of the few Christian traditions to wholly originate in the Christian church. So it's interesting. A lot of people don't like Santa Claus. They don't celebrate him. They don't want to tell their kids about Santa Claus and then later on say, well, he wasn't really real. And that's fine. No criticism of that whatsoever. You have to do what you feel is right for your family. But it is interesting that we have all of these pagan traditions that we brought in without any question, and we bring them right into our homes. And yet it's just funny that this is one that 100% originates in Christianity. It doesn't come from any other culture. It comes right from this guy Saint Nicholas, and yet it's one that can be controversial in Christian circles. So just an interesting thing to think about as we continue to look through this. And we have another one in this idea of abbreviating Christmas to what some would call Xmas, but what you're going to see is that's really not correct. Another tradition of Christmas which offends some Christians also originated with the Christian church. The practice of abbreviating Christmas with what we look at as the English letter X and MAS. It is thought that the abbreviation is an attempt to pull Christ from Christmas. So some people that look at this think that this is what people are doing. They don't like Christ, so they're throwing his name out and just putting an X there. And I'm not saying that there's not some people that maybe look at it that way. They may think that that's what they're doing, but this actually is something that's steeped in history, and it's not that at all. That's not where it came from. However, its use did not originate as an irreverent one, dating back to the earliest days of the Christian church. Many of the earliest followers of Christ spoke and wrote in Greek. The Greek word for Christ is Christos. Pronounced Christos, it's the Greek letters chi, rho, iota, sigma, tau, omicron, and then sigma. So this is the name for Christ in Greek. You see it there if you're watching this, not just listening to it. You see it on the screen there, written out in Greek, and you see right at the very beginning of that word is the Greek letter chi, and it looks just like an English X. Many early Christians used the Greek chi as a symbol of faith. Let me also say this to you. You may hear some people pronounce this chi, but that's not correct. The Greek letter is actually chi. It's the same sound as you see in the word lock. So lock is spelled, the end of lock is CH. It's not a ch sound, it's a k sound. So Greek chi. And it was seen early on in the church as a symbol of faith because it was an easy thing to replicate. You could put the Greek letter chi on your places of worship. You could write it in the dirt. You could identify each other. We also know that the ichthus was used in the same way. That's the fish symbol that you see. Some people have it on their cars. It was used in the same way. It was a way for Christians to identify one another. It was also symbolic of Christ. I don't have time to get into that right now. But this letter chi was used for Christ way early on. It was a very ancient church tradition to use the Greek letter chi, as a symbol of the Christian faith. So this originates right at the very core, the very foundation of Christianity. Therefore, the use of the Greek letter chi for Christ is one of the oldest traditions of the Christian faith. So this is very well rooted. Now we move forward now to the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, many of the poor became educated about the Christian faith, but most of these people could not read. So you couldn't just write out the name Christ. They wouldn't have known what it was. So the educators of them adopted this ancient Christian symbol for Christ, the Greek chi, and it was used. So it was very easy for people to see this X, what they thought was an X. And it was explained to them that this was a symbol for the name Christ. Probably or maybe didn't even explain to him that it was a Greek chi. It's just an X. It didn't matter. So the common people soon recognized X as a symbol for Christ, the letter chi, but what they might have looked at as the English letter X. So these people in the Middle Ages, they couldn't read, but they could identify this letter. And so wherever they saw it, they knew that was symbolic for the name of Christ. And so they recognized us as such. And so anything that they saw they would see this letter, they weren't looking at it as an X that's Xing out Christ. They're looking at it as a symbol for Christ. So during the 16th century, the word Christmas, it's abbreviated. Some people see it as Xmas, but that's not what it is, began to appear in the writings of Catholic monks and clerics. So this abbreviation was used commonly in Christian writing. It was used respectfully, not as a way of Xing out Christ, but just as a way of abbreviating his name. And so what it comes down to is it's simply an abbreviation. The X is not the English letter X, the letter there, as some assume, but it is the Greek letter chi, representing the Greek name for Christ. So when you see that anywhere, you don't read it Xmas, you read it You can read it Chimas, but really it's Christmas. It's just an abbreviation for the name of Jesus. So nothing offensive about it, nothing to be upset about. It's not taking away from Jesus. It's just an ancient Christian symbol for the name of Christ by using the first letter of his name in Greek, the Greek letter Chi. Let's talk about candy canes. There's a lot of legends around candy canes, and it's hard to verify a lot of them, but we'll look at what we can verify. While hard candy has been around since ancient times, the candy cane as we know it today did not exist until 100 years ago, about 100 years ago. When children began receiving special treats on St. Nicholas Day in the 4th century, hard candy was probably one of the first things enjoyed, and the reason for that is it was hard to get. It was hard to create it was hard to make it. Getting the ingredients together were not cheap at that time. And so it was a rare treat. The kids might have got just a little bit of it once a year, but they loved it. And so a big, big deal for them was to get some hard candy on St. Nicholas Day. In 1670, there was a choir master at Germany's Cologne Cathedral, and he was faced with a problem. Now, understand as I go through this is a little bit of a legend. It's not 100% verified, but of the ones that are out there, this is the one that's the most likely to be true. So here's a choir master. He's at the cathedral in Cologne, Germany, and he has a problem. He's got children in the choir, but during these services, they become restless and get noisy. And he's the guy that is tasked with keeping them straight. So what is he going to do? Well, some people would resort to the stick, but he knows that he might whip them, and that'll get them quiet for a little while, but it ain't going to last. So what does he do? He resorts to bribery. He went to a local sweet shop looking for hard candy to keep the children occupied. He's saying, let me give them some candy. And not only will they be happy with that, but they're going to take time to eat it. And while they're stuffing their face with candy, they can't be talking. So he noticed while he was there some white sweet sticks. And he thought that would be the perfect thing because it's something easy for me to get and take to them. And it'll take them a little while to eat it. It's not something they can just eat really fast. And that'll get me through the service. But he still had another problem. He was afraid that parents and other church congregants would not like the children eating candy during services, and you can understand that. So he thinks, what am I going to do about this? And he gets an idea. He asked the candy maker if the sticks could be bent to create a crook at the top. And the candy maker assured him, yeah, I can do that, no problem. The choir master's plan was to utilize the sticks as a teaching tool so he can tell everybody, hey, this isn't just candy, but we're using this to teach the children. What are we teaching them? We're teaching them that the white color represents the sinless life of Christ, and the crook would serve as a way for the children to remember the story of the shepherds because of their shepherd staffs at Christ's birth. So here's a great solution. Yes, I'm giving the kids candy. It's keeping them quieted down during service, which you like, but it's also teaching them something. While they're eating it, they're remembering that the white color of the candy represents Jesus' purity and the sinless life that he lived. And the crook, it looks like a little shepherd staff. Well, I've told them that they should be reminded of the shepherd that came to visit Christ at his birth. So that made everybody happy. Well, the candy cane after that became popular to hang on Christmas trees, and it's really easy to know why because you've got a crook there already. So you can just hook it right on a branch, and it's easy to hang them. So they took off. It wasn't, though, until the 1920s that Bob McCormick, who ran a small confectionery in Albany, Georgia, found a way to hand twist colors into the candy canes. So the legends that we have about the candy canes that are in existence before this time, especially way earlier in the 1600s and 1700s and that time, they're likely not true because it was very difficult for them to twist colors into the candy canes. It would have been a very labor-intensive, time-consuming project. And so the widespread of candy canes with colors in them, the red and white, it's just not very likely that they would have had those then. They may have been able to make a few for a small group of people, but not a widespread thing where everybody would have them. So those legends are probably not true. The candy canes were very likely were just white until this time. And so Bob McCormick finds a way to twist colors into the candy canes, and he does a lot of different colors. But then there's an Indiana candy maker and had a priest for a brother, and he made his candy canes with 3 small stripes representing the Trinity and 1 thick red stripe representing the blood of Christ. Now, there's a little bit of confusion about this. Some people think the candy cane originated with these colors to represent these things, and it didn't. There's actually a legend that in England, when Christmas was outlawed, that the candy canes were created as a way to kind of circumvent the law against celebrating Christmas, because you could use it to say, hey, look at these symbols. It's got the red, it's got three thin red stripes. That's the Trinity. It's got one thick red stripe. That's the blood of Jesus. That was a legend. It's almost 100% not true. But this guy in Indiana, he had heard about it from his brother who was a priest. And so he took something that was actually like an urban legend, something not probably correct, and incorporates it into his candy canes and actually makes something happen that was just a legend. He actually makes it real. So even though it almost 100% didn't originate from that time in England, now we do have it. And this Indiana candy maker intended for those symbols to be there. So it's okay to teach children that the candy cane represents the shepherd's staff and it represents the purity of Jesus and his blood and the Trinity. But don't go thinking that that's why the candy cane was developed. It really wasn't. There's probably some truth in this choir master wanting to use the candy cane with kids and putting the crook on it. But the other stuff was legend that actually ended up being incorporated into it. So that's where it came from, more than likely. And from that time, candy canes were used to teach these truths to children. This brings us to our last one. We want to look at the Yule log. The word Yule was first used to describe an ancient Viking ritual that celebrated the winter solstice. Yule is derived from the Norse word Yule, which means wheel. This word was probably used to describe the ritual because many Norse people viewed their calendar as a wheel turning through the seasons. So this Yule log is directly related to an ancient Viking ritual that had to do with pagan worship, and they used it for that. As a part of the solstice celebration, the Vikings would cut a huge log, drag it back to the village, and set it afire. The Yule log was seen to have the ability to drive away evil spirits, bring good luck, and welcome the sun back to the skies. So very much a pagan idea with this Yule log, but started out here with these Norsemen, and the word comes from that. But they're not the only ones who use these types of logs. In Egypt, the practice of burning logs for the celebration of the winter solstice dates back to 5000 BC. Many other ancient groups burned similar logs, so it was very common for this to take place. In Roman culture, the Persian sun god Mithras was adopted. The Romans burned a log during the initial days of Saturnalia to usher in another year of the strong rule of Mithra. So goes right along with what they're celebrating at Saturnalia, the idea of the sun coming back into prominence. And they just adopt this idea of this Persian sun god. And when they do that, they get the idea of burning this log to celebrate that during Saturnalia. When the Vikings invaded Britain during the Middle Ages, they brought their customs with them, including the Yule log. The Celtic Druids picked up on this tradition. In the 4th century, the ceremonies began to move indoors. Celts and Gaelic Europeans dragged large logs into the hearths of their homes. So the big Yule log, the huge log that was out in the town, that slowly started to become logs that were brought into the home. And they would take these logs and they would even prepare them for a full year. They would dry them out. They would pack them with spices and wine, things that when it burned, it would smell really good and be very fragrant in the home. So they would prepare these Yule logs through the year. They even would take a piece of the Yule log that had burned the previous year. They would hold on to it and they would use it to burn the new Yule log. So kind of perpetually using the wood from the previous year to start the fire in the new year. And so this was going on early on. During the same time, Eastern Christians were calling the celebration of Christmas the Feast of Lights. During the festival, a log was burned to symbolize the end of the world's darkness with the coming of Christ. So Christians developed their own legend of using this burning log to teach about Jesus Christ. It was called the Feast of Lights. It was an Eastern Christian tradition, but Western Christians knew about it as well. And so as Christians moved into Britain, they found it easy to adopt the Yule log custom because of their knowledge of the Feast of Lights. So they're thinking, hey, we've already got a custom that's just like what you're doing with the Yule log. So we're going to bring the Yule log into what we're doing. You already know about it. Let us teach you about the Feast of Lights. Let us teach you about the coming of the light into the world. And so incorporated right away was the Yule log already had been brought into the culture. So it wasn't a big departure from what they already had. But the name Yule log, it came from when they came into these areas and found that the people there had taken on this tradition of burning the log and calling it a Yule log, and it just incorporated it right into Christmas, right into Christianity. And again, one that maybe not as much practiced today, but you at least hear about it in some of the songs around Christmas, and you may have been curious about that tradition. So I hope you enjoyed this today. This is just the tip of the iceberg. You can spend a lot of time digging into the traditions of Christmas. Just a word about this. Hopefully you'll understand from this study, the brief time we've had today, that most of the traditions that are associated with Christian holidays come from pagan origins. That might bother some people, but understand there is a reason for this. It was done because people wanted to try to bring Christianity to pagan people in a way they could understand it. And so it makes all the sense of the world. If you can use something that people already know about to explain the truth of Christianity, then you're just going to have an easier time explaining it to them. Jesus did it himself. He used in his parables traditions, things that were common in the culture. He talked about plant life and growing crops. He used things, stories about a woman sweeping her house or light coming into a dark place. People were familiar with those things. They knew what he was talking about. And it just made it easier for them to understand a true principle that was revealed by God, has been revealed by God, by using common things in this world that people already knew about. So it might bother your conscience, and you have to go with what you feel is right, but it doesn't bother me because I think that the reason for it is sound, and it obviously is very effective. People were able to adopt Christianity more easily because they came to understand it based on some things that they already knew. And it was an aha moment where they were able to say, okay, we've been celebrating this holly, but now I'm seeing it in a different light. I've known the holly bush because I've had it in my house for years. And now I'll remember it as the crown of thorns of Jesus, the blood that he shed. It's a very effective way of doing things. A lot of that meaning is probably lost today. Christmas has become very commercialized and very secular, but it's one of the ways that you can recapture some of the truths behind it is to go back and look at these traditions. So I'll point you to a couple of sources that I use primarily for information for this study today, and that is the website history.com. It has some great information about Christmas. I also got a book. It's called Stories Behind the Great Tradition of Christmas by Ace Collins. You can find that on Amazon.com. You can buy the hardback book or soft cover, not sure which one it is, or you can do like I did and just download it on a Kindle if you have a Kindle. But those are a couple of sources that I used. I thought they were very good, and I'd recommend them if you're interested in more information about this. But there's hundreds of things out there. You just Google this. Now I understand some of it comes from some not great sources, so you have to be kind of careful about using things that you trust. But again, there's so much great information, and we do have such a good time celebrating Christmas. I hope that you have a wonderful Christmas this year. I hope it's a blessed time to be with family and friends and a great time of joy and celebration, the very essence of what Christmas began as and became. But more than anything, I hope that you are filled with joy, peace, and comfort in knowing and understanding that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came into this world. He stepped out of heaven, left the glories of heaven to take on a body of flesh and be born as a human being. And the sole reason he did it was to live a life and become a sacrifice for our sins. And so we can have a relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ because of what he did at the time that we don't know when it happened exactly, but we celebrate it at Christmas time on December 25th. And again, I hope that you have a very, very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and God bless you.